All right, good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us here at the Polygon Gallery on this balmy spring evening. My name is Elliott Ramsey, and I'm curator here at the Polygon Gallery. And as we begin tonight's event, I'd like to take a moment to situate us in the village of Asahan, which has been home to members of the Squamish Nation and their families for thousands of years. And as a cultural organization working within and across the unsurrendered and ancestral territories of the Musqueam Band and the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations, we endeavor continually to strengthen our sense of place, to deepen our understanding of the histories and contexts that we inhabit, and to conduct our work here at the Polygon with a strong sense of the Indigenous futures that our activities affect. Tonight, we are proud to be partnering with another cultural organization here, Capture Photography Festival, to welcome Dr. Mark Seeley, curator of the exhibition Rotimi Fani-Kayode, Tranquility of Communion, currently on view right here at the Polygon. It's been an honor to bring this extraordinary exhibition here, and we couldn't have done it without the incredible support of Ron Reagan and Bruce Monroe Wright. So thank you both for your generosity. And I also want to extend a note of gratitude to our members whose foundation of support allows us to bring exhibitions and artists of the highest caliber right here to North Vancouver. And I'm also deeply grateful to Emmy Lee Wall, the Executive Director of Capture Photography Festival, for her partnership in promoting this exhibition and co-organizing tonight's event. And I'd like to invite Emmy now to share a few words.
Thanks, Elliott. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for this Curator's Talk with Mark and Elliott. I want to start by thanking the Polygon for their collaboration. I'm so consistently impressed with the Polygon's stellar programming, but I'm also really moved by the ways in which Reed, Monica, and Elliott and the rest of the Polygon team have always supported the broader art community. Monica, I want to give a special thank you to connecting us with the Critical Image Forum. Thank you to Althea and everyone there for supporting this talk. We're really excited to be working with you. I also want to thank Capture's dedicated staff who helped coordinate the moving parts for this event, in particular Sarah Wrong, our TD Assistant Curator of Engagement, and Carmen Levy-Milne, our Development and Grant Coordinator. Capture is really lucky to have the support of many sponsors and donors, and I particularly want to thank TD Bank, who's our presenting sponsor. And I'm also really grateful to Wesgroup, whose generous sponsorship was dedicated to the speaker series this year. Please join us for a second speaker series talk on Thursday, April 10th, right here at the Polygon Gallery with David Campany. And last but not least, Mark, I first heard you speak in Toronto when you were in conversation with Tyler Mitchell. You were so masterful in shaping that dialogue and connecting Tyler's practice to broader critical dialogues. I remember people leaving that talk so moved they were actually crying. And I thought, oh, I've got to get this guy to come to Vancouver. And since that time, you were here to chat with Ken Montague for As We Rise. You've written for our catalog, and you've now also curated our Arbutus Greenway billboards this year with the powerful work of Monica de Miranda. And we're so grateful to you for your continued collaboration and support. So I've already heard Mark talk, and so I know we're in for a treat, and Elliott's pretty fantastic as well, so I'll turn it back over.
Thank you, Emmy. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest of honor, Dr. Mark Seeley, as I join him in discussion about the life and work of Rotimi Fani-Kayode and the process of curating the artist's first major touring North American survey. Dr. Mark Seeley, Order of the British Empire, has been the executive director of London-based photographic arts charity Autograph since 1991 and has produced numerous artist publications, curated exhibitions, and commissioned photographers and filmmakers worldwide. Core to his role at Autograph has been the commissioning of new works by artists and the development of a now internationally recognized photographic collection dedicated to issues of race, rights, and representation. In 2019, Mark published his now acclaimed best-selling book, Decolonizing the Camera, Photography in Racial Time. In 2020, he joined the University of Arts London academic staff and is currently Professor of Photography, Rights and Representation presentation. His third book on photography writings, A Lens on Liberation, Photography as Resistance, will be published summer 2025, so looking forward to that. He is currently the artistic director of the 2026 Hamburg Photography Triennial, and Mark is a member of the International Advisory Committee of World Press Photo. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Seeley.
Thank you, Elliott. Oh, God, it's getting a chair. Get it up. Moving from one bit of vinyl to the next. There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll take my jacket off as well.
Sure, get comfortable.
Yeah. Lounge.
I think, and I'm curious to know where you want to start and take this conversation, Mark. I know you've got quite a bit of, visual reference materials we might look at over the course of this discussion, but also kind of keeping it free flowing and seeing where it unfolds. And I think where I kind of want to start is a question that I think has come up a lot as we've talked about Rotimi Fani-Kayode being an artist who is having this, who's had a really international career. We've seen his work in many contexts, in many group exhibitions, many of them recent. Most recently, I saw it at the Edges of Elliott exhibition at the Whitney Museum. Yes. It's in my touring show, As We Rise. It was in the show about the 80s at the Tate right now, and so on and so forth. In terms of this large survey, a comprehensive survey of the work, why now? Oh, sorry.
That's it, okay.
The clickers there.
Okay, yeah.
Why now? What prompted? Why did you decide that now was the time?
I think the reality is, Elliott, is that I think the question why now might be a bit of a red herring. I think the why now might start in like 1988, 89.
Yeah.
I think, posthumously when someone like Rotimi dies, there's a moment where, they represent quite a seminal, there's a moment where they represent quite a seminal shift, a kind of a seismic shift. There's a moment really of reflection in terms of what's actually happening at that time. I mean, we have to look at Rotimi through the lens of, Thatcherite, Reaganite politics. We have to look at Rotimi through the lens of, homophobia, HIV. We have to look at Rotimi through the lens of, exclusionary cultural politics. We have to look at Rotimi as a child of exile. We have to look at him as someone who's really trying to, find their way in the world as a kind of black gay man, and someone who's also trying to build community and inclusion, someone who's really kind of beginning to see themselves as part of a kind of global diaspora of different voices. So I guess the why now, if you want to look at it like that, and in terms of time, I'm very interested in time. The why now really is a question that reverberates across 3-4 decades, if you like. So it's a kind of echo, and I guess until that kind of echo finds its kind of, resonant kind of, redundancy, if you like, then the why now will always be asked. Because what happens, really quite clearly, is that artists like Rotimi are part of what I would call a kind of cultural turn. Every few years, there's a kind of reflective moment, especially since, let's just argue, post-World War II, that there's a space of kind of reflection within the kind of cultural, Western, ideological museum space that starts to wonder what it's doing, starts to think about its positionalities. It starts to think about who's been left, what's happened, what disasters have occurred, and how might we change. Now, change in those moments, change in those moments, happens, but then maybe the cultural turn drops off again. So, but some stuff sticks, right? But then the worm turns again. And I'd argue right now we're seeing a kind of the worm turning in a kind of anti-clockwise way instead of the progressive rotations that we want. So within an artist like Rotimi, you see this kind of cultural turn, and over the years, the 90s, the noughties, the early teens of 2000, incredibly, and because there's advocacy behind it, things progress, things move on. So best part of 40 years, 35 years after his death, you're able to finally get to a place where you can genuinely use the word retrospective. You can genuinely have a look back. So in 19, am I doing the slides? If we go to very quickly, say somewhere like here, we already had a retrospective, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting, right? But it's a tiny retrospective.
Yeah.
It's a retrospective in a tiny little gallery in Brixton. It's a retrospective that says this was someone who simply passed.
Right.
It's a retrospective of kind of, it's a retrospective where friends come together. It's a retrospective where people like you, some of these names will be familiar to you. People like Chris Booter used to be director of Aperture. People like Maureen Paley Gallery in London. People like Sandy Nairn, who used to be the director of the National Portrait Gallery. People like, where are they? There's people like John O'Comfort, Isaac Julian, David A. Bailey. You know, these are key people, but back in the day, they were, you know, activists, if you like. So we've already had a retrospective in many ways. Each of these people paid to have their name probably on that list. Probably a little £5, right? But, you know, Ivana Blazuk was there. She was the director of the Whitechapel for many years. Really important seminal players. Eddie Chambers, now working. Paul Womble. These are all people working in the space. So it's like, why now? And this illustrates that point, that 30 years on, you can probably do what might be termed a retrospective. So that autograph agency place is only 2 years old in that moment, but you're galvanizing, bringing community together, asking people to support, asking people to invest, no matter what it is, in something that instinctively most people felt was important and that something had passed. But you can't let those things go, really, if you want to take responsibility and if you want to be an agent in the game of making things visible.
And as we talk about, as you talk about that, that's so many great points come up. Where that comes up is, you know, that we've had this retrospective. And one thing with Tranquility of Communion was that the term retrospective really hasn't been used to talk about this show. It's been a survey. It's been a career survey. Why that distinction? Why was that important for you?
Survey?
Yeah.
Because it's, for the first time, some of this work has been brought into the public realm. And I think, you know, it's amazing what time does, because all of a sudden 30 years has gone by. And you realize that you've got this material which you're looking after, and that, you know, you occasionally, if you're lucky, get some, you know, a week or two or a few days to look back through and flit through, and as time goes by. I mean, in all honesty, when I first looked at these drawings 30 years ago, I'm like, these are terrible. Oh God, thank God he picked up the camera. He's just like, and it's like, we're moving offices from one space to the next, and space is absolutely critical. And it's like, maybe we should ditch this stuff, because I'm tired of this wooden box in the corner full of these drawings. They're just awful, right? So we move them on. But then as you mature and you start to look through the work, you start to see things differently, right? You kind of realize that what do? You kind of grow up. You start to see the connections across things. You start to see, actually, these drawings are really quite insightful sketches into where the work was going, right? So, and you could begin to think, actually, if I spend more time, you know, reflecting back on the work, those drawings, you think, oh, of course, they're kind of, he's replaying this sensitive, tender moments, these entangled bodies, these relationships, both black and white, and he's finally articulating through his use of the camera. So they're becoming really important moments of survey to kind of join the dots with. Right. So as we survive as an organization, you get more time to do the work. Yeah. When you're in the survival game, you're just constantly in first and second gear, screaming through the gearbox, trying to get into a place where you've got a little bit more, you know, space in the engine to kind of rev it up a little bit. But while you're screaming through production, things like that get left behind. You don't get time to think through the work because you're always in the making process. What's interesting now, probably what I'm arguing for in terms of our funding status, is the rear view mirror has to be really front and central. If we're going to go forward, we have to have that rear view mirror. We have to have both wing mirrors absolutely aligned, but we also need to see the path forward. And that's part of actually making progress work really well.
Indeed. So I'm curious about, you know, speaking about this archive that this exhibition is drawn from. As we look at Tranquility of Communion, how much of the archive that Rotimi left does a show like this represent? What was the editing process that went into bringing these works together?
Well, these are just some of the moments that are part of the work, really. The contact sheets, etc. This is Rita Keegan, actually, a celebrated artist who is a friend and partner from North America. Rita, she's lovely. What is the process? How much work is there?
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of work, actually. But one of the things that I was doing was trying to look through again, trying to find through the contact sheets the evidential marks of his inquiry. So you're looking for the chinagraphs, you're looking for the pen marks, you're looking for the parts where someone might have paused. It's actually quite forensic when you do that work.
Sure.
You know, it's not saying I like. You're looking for the parts where you might just find a pen mark, you might find a little dot in the corner. You're just trying to spend and take the time. You're realizing as well, you know, in terms of dating the work that, you know, there's codes in terms of his contacts, that's Roti, and then it's like the 11th of the 10th, 88, so that's the date. You're realizing that you got to start looking for the things that are really relevant within that space.
Right.
So, I mean, the selection process is about trying to find the things that caught his eye by spending time with the contact sheets. And it's really quite interesting because when people are working, there is often little marks, little chinagraphs, little pen marks, little things that are actually there that you can begin to pick up on. And then there are things which are, you know, clearly cast aside or just written off or crossed out. Wow. So you have to spend the time doing that work. I mean, it's a 4 or 5 year process, really, to be honest. I mean, not every day, but in terms of, you know, we need the time to do that.
Yeah.
So you have to park, when you're directing an arts organization, you have to park the time to think about doing that work. And plus the fact, really, to be honest, Rotimi was a founding signatory of autographs, so he's very key to the story.
Right.
And it would be wrong to leave him behind. Right? And when there was such a body of work produced in such a short period of time, 6, 7, 8 years worth of production, I was determined that we would do this work, right? So it had nothing really. It's not a labor of love. It's a labor of commitment, really, because in many ways, you know, you do feel as though there is an obligation that you have. If no one else is going to do the work, then you've got to do that work, right?
Yeah.
That's part of the obligation of doing it. I could be turning my attention to, you know, global superstars and think about, you know, jumping the next wave of celebrity artists, which there are many now, and there are many black celebrity artists, and many celebrity artists from around the world could easily fit within our mission statement. But if I leave people like Rotimi out of the conversation, then I'm doing a disservice to that space, right? And also, it's not like a kind of romantic scenario. It's not like a love kind of game. The work is actually really interesting.
Absolutely.
The work, what he was trying to do was really brave. It's really kind of out there. This is a West African, you know, artist coming out of a fairly middle-class family who's, you know, queer in an incredibly homophobic society. That's just the West African part. Arriving in Britain in an incredibly aggressive, you know, homo-aggressive society as well. You know, in a racist kind of Britain, which is not particularly tolerant or accepting to black artists either. So you've got work that's really pushing the boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And every time he shows a picture, the word Mapplethorpe comes up, which is totally like boring. And it's like, because no one had done the work, no one had understood what he was thinking through, and no one had had the opportunity to see the breadth of where this idea of tenderness and intimacy and transgression and Yoruba cultures and, you know, these entangled moments of, what are they? Traces of ecstasy that he's trying to inquire through. This is not a practice based in kind of phallocentric pornography where the penis is up front in your face and, you know, jumping out of you as a moment of kind of, you know, transgressive kind of, what's the word, erotic kind of drivers, which photography, of course, is full of. This is a different level of inquiry. This is a place of pushing you to thinking about, you know, what it means to be a bhikkhu, you know, born to die within a kind of tradition. This is a place where thinking about how do you articulate these ideas have been trapped within a kind of, you know, embryonic sac and been born into a place where you feel as though your destiny is possibly death, right? But unless we've got the articulation behind that, unless you're commissioning arts, you know, cultural theorists like, you know, Cobham and Mercer's really brilliant essay that he did on Rotimi's work, unless you're creating the dynamics where that research work can be done, where that art history can be made, remade, rethought, represented. Because I think it's really important to note that you have sometimes, if the points of reference are there, you have to find the scholars to do that work. You have to pay people to do that work. You have to find the points of entry where you build those new histories. You can't keep on referring back to those old historical tropes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You have to make it work. You have to dig into the points of reference. You have to understand why twinning is so important within Yoruba culture, and how back in the day, before photography was employed in West Africa, if twins were born, wooden figures would be carved out and presented, and if someone died, those figures still remained as part of their presence. It's a different spirituality. It's a different cosmos. It's a different world, right? And that's part of what's really appealing about engaging into that space. When you allow yourself to unpack, when you allow yourself to unpack the things that you're familiar with, then you arrive and you take off into a journey. The only way that you can describe it is a bit like what happens when you're a kid and you arrive in the first concert or the first disco or the first audio experience where you finally allow yourself to dance unjudged. And this is what this work is like. Once you allow yourself to dance unjudged in front of it, they're in a totally different place.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me when I saw the work, when it sort of arrived here and I got to see it up close and spend time with it, was just so much compassion in the work. So compassion from behind the camera wrote to me as a photographer, and the way that he casts and holds the people that he's photographing, the way that he's presenting them, as well as within the frame as well. There's such a gentleness, I think, between a lot of the figures, and a lot of this play that is just so tender and sensual without being sexual, actually, in a way that's really...
I think that's a really important point. But these are also friends and lovers and community, if you like.
Yes, of course.
These are not, paid for model. A lot of these people were, some of them... What's great about this as well, once we start doing the show, is that people are emerging. I got a text the other day or an email the other day from someone saying, I am that model. So it's like living history still.
Yeah.
And it's great because as soon as you then find that person, you can find out what went on that day in that studio, right? Which adds to like, well, what was happening? Well, we were having fun, we were messing around, we were doing this stuff. I suggested, we pick up the bottle or I play the pipe. It's totally collaborative kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because actually, it's not that long ago, right?
No,
Most of these people will
exactly.
be like 60, 65 maybe, if you're lucky, or maybe slightly younger. But it's like they're around. Not everybody, thank God, got wiped out by the virus, right? So, and it's also the kind of cultural aspect of what he was looking at, these kind of angelic kind of spaces. As I say, these kind of multiples, these models, these lovers, these friends, these ideas of kind of like recreating Black subjectivity in the mix of this idea of looking for this idea of tranquility, kind of peace. What I like really about Rotimi's work, or what I really enjoy about it most, is that there's a kind of calming process within it. It doesn't really feel like it's agitated.
No.
It feels like there is moments of kind of, like this, for example, powerful interactions, white hands on black eyes. It's not the kind of work that's going to go, look, you're the bad one in the room, right? He's not going to do that. It's not going to go, this is where, guilt lives. It's more a case of like, this is where communion lives, right? And then here, very smartly, I think he's talking to, the history of photography in relationship to the Black body.
Of course.
It's like replacing the kind of gentle area with a camera talks hugely about all that kind of ethnographic archival material that has got so much focus on the Black body in some shape or form, the fascination with, genitalia or like needing to see, that kind of like forensic pornography. I mean, there's a brilliant conversation with that through just this one photograph, asking us to think about what it is that the camera has done. And we know, we know the archive is full of that crap, which we've never even been allowed to see.
Yeah, certainly.
I mean, really dark stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. With Rotimi's work, I'm interested in actually in these gum bichromate prints is where I was going to kind of go next.
Good.
And I'm curious about them because if you've read the book Blood Flowers by
Yes.
W. Ian Borland, he says that these were more of an experiment towards the end of Rotimi's life. We have them dated here as 1984, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this very archaic, very arcane in a way, photographic process that he and Alex Hurst both experimented with.
Do you know what was great back in the day
Yeah.
is that we were surrounded by community darkrooms, right? So
Right.
in Southeast London, for example, there would have been monochrome, there would have been photofusion, there would have been Pimlico, Pimlico, it was a school, Pimlico School and darkrooms. It was really interesting because photography was seen as part of that community activity. There was like, darkrooms were, part of what were accessible.
Right.
And what happened is really quite simple, is that there were courses. People were running weekend courses and artists were doing them, right? It's that simple. And people wanting to push the medium, they'd go there with their, their negatives and their papers, and someone would be saying, this is how you make a gum bichromate, right?
Huh.
And therein lies the kind of idea of experimenting, having access to the point of making is what these works were about.
Right.
And I think that they were, I would say that they were, both Alex and Rotimi, history's just a nightmare. Because just when you think you've located something, something else turns up and says it's wrong.
Right, of
So that's fine.
Yeah.
I live with the contradictions of history all the time. I think it's great. You say it's black, I'll say it's white. You say you're dead, I'll say it's alive. It's part of a dialogue, right?
Yeah.
The problem that people have with history is that they want it to be fixed. It's
Exactly.
not fixed.
Yeah.
So it keeps on moving because the more we learn, the more we know, the more we unhinge things, the better understanding we have about the fluidity of knowledge. And that's really about point of view.
Right.
So the sooner we bury all those kind of old academics that keep on wanting to nail everything down, then the better we'll all be.
Right.
So, history writers and forensic scientists, we need them, but they're just keys to open doors for further inquiry.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually that simple. I know that these were all part of kind of like, work that you went to for the weekend. You took the work and you practiced, and then you might practice further at home. Right?
Okay.
So we know that that's what you went and you did stuff, and you paid a tiny £3, £4, £5 to do this work, and then it's left in the box, and then people like me come along later and go, "Wow, these are amazing! Look at my prints." And we go, "Yeah, let's get them up, let's show them," because it ties up, and you want to show the process of investigation.
Yeah.
That's why they're in the show. That's why they're in the archive.
Yeah.
And that's why they're kind of careful. They're quite rare now because there's not that many of them, and they become quite special.
Right.
But they are really about process.
Yeah. Just trying a different process.
It would be wrong for me to say anything else, really, because I'm not there, I'm not in the room, and I'm not saying, Rotimi, what are you doing with this stuff, right? So all you can do is just reveal the parts that kind of transgress slightly off-piste, and then present the fact that they are working with the work itself.
Yeah.
So beyond the work, beyond the framing, and taking the work, drawing on it, painting on it, working with it, he's moving to a place of beyond photography, if you like.
Yeah.
He's moving to a place where the making is really important. But he was always there. That's why the Polaroids are important. Because you can see from the very early beginning of the Polaroids, there's markings on them, drawings on them, disrupting stuff. I mean, inherently, someone like Rotimi is a disruptor within the medium. But he's a disruptor in life.
Right.
He's a disruptor in terms of not being the kind of kid his parents wanted, right? He understands that. So he is not really going to be straight.
Right. Of course.
Of course.
And so I'm interested too in bringing together the gum bichromate prints, some of the vintage prints, the Polaroids. That's the archive section of the show. The last body of work that Rotimi produced, the Nothing to Lose, Bodies of Experience. That was the last. That's the theater section.
Yes, these color
of the
works
show.
are the last pieces.
These color works. So there's kind of, and then in between those, we have the museum section of the show, which is the gelatin silver prints. To kind of go maybe for a second to these works, to Every Moment Counts and Nothing to Lose, Bodies of Experience. To what extent, he goes from working for a number of years in black and white photography, presumably because that's affordable, you know, 35 millimeter film and medium format cameras. And then in 1989, very close to the end, goes to this. So I of course, one can read into, and the titles, of course, evoke every moment counts, you know, that now is the time. As you look at Rotimi's archive and the work that he left behind, is there a sense of resolution in these works? Or did you discover, maybe, did you see possible ideas for what would be next if he could have made
So there's
it?
there's very little of these works. There's not that many of the color works.
Yeah.
So it is quite clearly a kind of shift.
Yeah.
Quite a big shift.
A big shift, yeah.
Yeah, they're very, so they're medium format. I mean, I hate the technical stuff in photography. Anyway, it doesn't matter what they are. This is what they are now, and they're out there, and you can see them. So I'm not going to do all that. They are kind of beautiful, saturated, well-staged, articulate pieces.
Yeah.
They're made in a small flat in Brixton. That's the studio, right? So
That's
they're really quite small in their staging.
Yeah.
He's obviously, when you can look back through the sketchbooks and the notes, there's a conversation with classical art history, whether it's Caravaggio, Rembrandt, or whatever.
Yeah.
There's a kind of dialogue with all those religiosity type paintings. So, and also if you look back through the work, there is a kind of moment where it kind of comes together, you know, technically, guess so. But in terms of the ideas, there's a confidence in this work.
Yeah.
Because you can feel as though there's not that many repetitions in the framing of them. You know, there's only 12 frames on each roll of film, obviously. But there's you can see how they're playing through. If I skip through, I think I put in some color. We'll come back to things in a bit. I think further on, there you are.
Ah.
Okay. So you can see that these, what is that, 12, 10 frames on the medium format film, you can see that there's a kind of, the idea in play has been well worked through, okay? You can see that there's a kind of inquiry into thinking about what might make the cut or not. None of these actually did for the prints that we know, but each of them could be, made. So you can see what's happening. There's a kind of staging behind it. Very close to the work at the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 images of trying to work out the idea of desire and fruit and those kind of conversations.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they're coming together in a way that is not like this, maybe. They're a bit more, this work is in conversation with this work for sure. So it's towards the end. He's more mature. He's, working it out, I think.
Yeah. I'm curious, so going back to 1988, say when Autograph is formed, and as the Association of Black Photographers, and Rotimi is one of the founding signatories, what did Autograph look like during Rotimi's lifetime? Because you then took over in 1991 and started to give it the shape that we know now as kind of this.
What did the Autograph look like?
Yeah, I'm curious.
I'm sorry, that is funny. It did look like a bunch of disaffected nightmares.
Okay, say more.
A bunch of disaffected nightmares who all wanted a piece of something which they didn't quite know what it was.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I've got old black and white. I've got old. What have I got? I've got old dreads, who want to do documentary photography, and I've got queer Nigerians who have been in the country since they were 9, who are gay, and I've got homophobic nightmare Jamaicans, and I've got transgressive middle class Africans. I've got mixed race Brits like myself, who are kind of working class from the north, and I've got kind of London black kids who think that they're the next best thing to, I don't know, whatever, right? So we're in an age of all kinds, and then I've got riot around the corner because Brixton's burning in '85. I've got police who want to kill people for fun, literally, you've got National Fronts, and you've got skinheads, and you've got Rock Against Racism, and you've got nightclubs. You've got stuff happening. It's quite vibrant. On top of that, you've got a very strong black feminist movement pushing against and wanting the same spaces and fighting. There's internal stuff happening all over the place. People are ripping necks off each other for fun in the game of politics. It's robust stuff, right? I mean, this is like, you know, like socialist collective spirit in one room. Take away the enemy, and people will just eat each other. My job, excuse me, I've got this lingering thing. My job, in a funny kind of way, was to, you know, in an office the size of probably this chair and this thing and a railway line out here, was to try and make sense of that. And I think we had a conversation the other night with colleagues from Vancouver, and we're just talking about, you know, you do have to enter into a kind of, what's the mode? You have to keep an eye on a prize. You have to manage what you've got, and you have to put the kind of squawking nightmares in a box over here, and you have to try and think, and you know, articulate kind of, you know, leadership over here, and that articulate leadership can quiet that space down, and then with the articulate leadership, you can find the support that you need from the state or whoever to try and build something in between the lines.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of politics of infrastructure building from disenfranchised societies, right? And somehow you have to be inclusive in that space.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's nothing worse than, you know, what people have to understand is that, you know, marginalized voices are really loud, both externally and internally. And the reason why they're so loud internally is because they've had, I'm going to be really frank, because often they've had jack shit, right? So it's annoying. And when you're in the same room with your colleagues, it gets vocal. And when someone's got something, it's really difficult to celebrate stuff, right? It's really difficult to be generous when other people feel as though they're not getting a piece of the pie. What I learned from spending time in North America, though, strategically, I learned from my African-American colleagues, is that what they do, they keep that stuff a little bit quieter, and they show up and they support, and they turn out and they say, this is okay, right? And they tend to keep the fighting differently. But that's like 400 years of kind of cultural rising, as we know from the As We Rise show, right? It's 400 years of that stuff.
Yeah.
Post-Britain, 1945, is 40 years of that stuff.
Yeah.
So there's an awful lot to learn and put in the bag in that place. Different histories, different trajectories, different relationships. And plus the fact they're coming into the UK as kind of like the mother country kind of like space. They're invited guests into this space. They're there to rebuild Britain post-World War II. They're in the factories, they're doing the stuff, but they're still like held back in that place.
Yeah.
So, you know, Vanley Burke, Armit Francis, Charlie Phillips, Neil Kinloch, they're all in the collection that Ken, we helped Ken buy this stuff. So, you know, he got a good deal as well, by the way, but it's all good. But it's all good. But, you know, it's like those artists are really important. You know, people like Rashini Kempadu, Maxine Walker, Joy Gregory. There are kind of, there's generational gaps between what their expectations are. And your autograph's role, not written in the Constitution anyway, is about managing what those expectations can be.
Okay. Thank you
It's social work in many issues.
It is.
Like we had
for
Armit
sure.
Francis in the room. He's 80 years old. He doesn't know what to do with his archive. He's going to die. Obviously, we all do. And it's like, where does this stuff go? So we're now seriously thinking about how do we look after that stuff? Because it's really important work.
On the subject of the archive, and this maybe will be my last question before we open it to audience questions, because I think we're coming up to, it's about 10 to 6.
Really?
I know, time
quick.
flies when you're having a great conversation like this. But on the subject of the archive,
Go through some
there's
of the
one
slides.
key figure who we haven't talked about, and that's sort of the person who would have brought the archive to you, Alex Hurst.
Alex was amazing. Alex was very, I mean, I think it's really important that these are the drawings and things that we were referring to earlier. I'll just make sure that the slides are kept in play. Alex was Rotimi's lover. He's upstairs in the gallery he's in the film talking about their relationship. Spend 20 minutes with him and his journey, and I think it will really unpack the special relationship that they had. Alex was a writer, really important. I think he helped Rotimi a lot. You know, one of the things about art history is that it's always about one name. There's always, it's like these were very much a couple.
Yeah,
You know?
and I'm
They
curious
were
about
lovers,
that.
right?
Yeah,
I
because
mean,
they collaborated a
Yeah.
lot, but it is, as you say, it's one name. It's Rotimi's name on
Yeah.
everything. As you sort of receive that archive, are there works where it's very clear that they're both named, or is there the sense that Alex's hand is in a lot of this stuff uncredited?
Alex did some work with the work after Rotimi died.
I
Is the way
see.
that I kind of look off. Is the way, and I think that Alex also spent a lot of time helping Rotimi think through what he was doing through these key moments. You know, they were intimate. Alex had a kind of art history background. Rotimi had a photography background. Alex is in the work sometimes. Rotimi's in the work sometimes. You know, it's very immersed. It's very. I think it's really important that those partners, that those figures who are behind people or in people's lives, who help people through their work, also get recognition. Alex was obviously quite seminal in that space. So I couple them and uncouple them.
I see. Yeah, thank you. I am maybe going to take questions from the audience if there are any. We're at about 10 minutes to 6. So if there's any questions from the audience, or I can just keep going. Okay, Emmy has a question.
You know, twins are very special within Yoruba culture. So, and if one dies, I mean, I think they're seen as like a gift from the gods, really, and they hold that they're just very special moments. No. But he's fully aware of what the twinning means within those kind of, you know, within that cosmology. I mean, I think often there was a kind of, it's a kind of deep spiritual kind of phenomena where there is twinning involved. And I think that they're celebrated and revered at the same time.
And the Yoruba as an ethnic population have one of the highest rates of identical twinning in the world. I don't know why that is, but I know a few sets of Yoruba twins as it happens. Yeah, I do. I used to work with one. Shia was a twin. Yeah. And so in the pantheon or in the among the deities, the divinities of Yoruba, the Orisha, as they're called, Ibeji is the twin figure who's a very popular one in a lot of rites and rituals and celebrations and beliefs. Yeah.
I think they're like a gateway to both worlds.
Yeah. Do you have a question? Ah, Abiku. Right. I can speak to that a bit. So Abiku, as Mark mentioned earlier in the talk, Abiku is a principle in Yoruba cosmology that means born to die, and it applies often to children who don't survive to adolescence, those who die young. And so sometimes parents will give their children what are called Abiku names, which is, in Yoruba, the names often have meanings. So Abiku names specifically mean things that are meant to sort of forestall early death. So things like, don't go, remain here, meanings like that. And so Rotimi discovered that he actually had an Ibiku name that meant stay by me. And so as he was looking very imminently towards the end of his life, and being surrounded, I think, by illness and with the AIDS crisis unfolding around him in his community, you see the title Abiku start to come into a lot of his black and white work.
Yeah. I mean, you're also, there's a kind of moment where, this is what I mean, you have to read the work in context of what was happening in the UK and around the world with the kind of HIV/AIDS crisis. So all kinds of phenomena have been drawn upon and through his work to understand what death is, right? And you'll find that a lot of artists were dealing with that religious or religious kind of imagery, really, to think through where they're traveling to, really. I mean, points of kind of savior, really, is what, I mean, if we go to, Somponai, this work we just had through here, Somponai, I mean, this is also a conversation around, the impact of HIV on the body. So there's a kind of intersectional, intertextual, intercultural relationship with the work, which is what I was saying earlier, as to why it's so special. So what's great about the work is that it demands work, right? So I always really encourage audiences to think through the work. And, one of my mantras, as I've said many times, is you have to ask yourself the question, is what's the work is doing? Rather than, I like that. And when you don't kind of get it in the first instance, we had to spend a lot of time with Rotimi's work to understand the work is doing. What's the language here? And I think that's why, when work comes from different kind of cultural backgrounds or perspectives or places, often we don't get it because we're not versed in that space. But all work really like this is a kind of act of generosity, right? So I think when someone makes something, there's two things which happens when the work is offered to the world from a kind of creative space. It's a gift, right? Now you can accept that gift, or you can go, I don't really want that. And I think the onus is on you, in terms of the audience, to think about how you accept that gift, right? And when work comes from, say, spaces and places that you don't kind of get, then you just simply have to ask yourself, how do I receive this? What kind of position am I in, culturally and politically, socially, economically, to take that gift? And then when you get that work, you become the bearer of that kind of space too, which is what's great about working in the arts. You become a transistor, right, for that space, almost an inherent kind of sonic presence for it. You talk about it, right? I mean, as an example of that, Hollywood dominates the narrative. Did you see that film? Did you? Well, artwork, and the reason why it dominates is because it's kind of everywhere, right? That's the stuff we get in our boxes. But artists like Rotimi, you are in that kind of receptive mode still. You have to be open enough to be receptive to it. And that was the difficult work for the cultural institutions like back in the day. They were not receptive to understanding that they have to do the work, right? It's like, I don't really get it. I mean, the amount of resistance to opening up the door, which is why it's great now that it's in the Tate, that it's in the Guggenheim, that it's in Arthur Walter's collection, that it's in, I don't know, all kinds of spaces now. Because the people that are buying into it, there's spaces where they can read it, they can understand what it is that they're getting, which is why the scholarship is really important. The writing behind the work is really important. It's about naming the dynamics and the kind of, it's why, whether we're talking about it from a kind of feminist perspective, it's like, write that history, right? It has to be in a place where we can share that space. So for me, when we're working with people like Rotimi and this retrospective, it's a gift from somewhere that passed like 30 years ago. And it's brilliant that it's still alive and that we have cultural institutions that can share that space, right? And that's why, in many ways, 30 years on and doing the job, there's a certain sense of like relief that you can go, that's in the world now. That's a labor. Everyone uses these words, labor and care. It's quite crass at the moment, to be honest. But it really does get on my nerves, I have to say. I mean, it's like, what do you want to do? Rest all day? It's like, I mean, I'm a working class boy, right? I like to I still think, unless I've moved a pile of bricks in a day, I haven't done any work. So writing and curating is like really quite pleasurable in many ways. Filling out funding applications isn't, or looking at spreadsheets certainly isn't. That's where the labor lives. But, I mean, I'm serious, but it's like, the labor is there and the work has been put into it, and you have to try and engage with that space. If you don't, fine. If it's not for you, brilliant. Move on and allow these gifts to arrive in the world.
I have one more question over here, and then I've got one more question for you, Mark.
I was going to try to sneak in 2 questions. You can stop.
Okay.
I just wanted to pick up on that last point that you were making. Is this work in particular, but also maybe more broadly, go back to that whole confluence of misfits that you were talking about, and everybody trying to get along. Is this work and all of their work, is it finding all the transistors right now? And it sounds like it's certainly finding, some large cultural institutions and some broad reach, but, if you use that kind of radio metaphor, is it crackling across the airwaves to corners here and there? Is it finding, the next generation that's going to, really be the bearers of making new work and not just, that kind of, even if you put a lot of scholarship into it, it can still just be a more throaty way of saying, I like that or I don't like that. So I'm curious about the kind of state of the transistors.
That's a good point.
For this and for the whole community.
No, that's a really good point. I think Zanelli Mahuli will be a transistor of Rotimi's work. Paul Sepoya is a transistor of the work. Ajamu is a transistor of it. There are all kinds of ways of kind of cutting and mixing and doing the DJ thing around it all. Cultural institutions are, they are receptive, but they're really, really cautious. And, they bow to pressure eventually. And they eventually, pick up on, or they need to pick up on what's really relevant. It takes them forever, by the way. I think I spent 3 years talking to a North American museum about acquiring one Rotimi Fani-Kayode. I think I've got a conversation with a Canadian institution which goes back at least 6 years to acquire a piece of work. I can name them if you want to, but it doesn't matter. It's more about the process. It's not their fault. But, you do realize how slow the burn is. I think it's a yes and a no. I think what I've learned about the issue for me is how long does it take? When you're young, you're really impatient. When you're older, you realize that you're really only part of a really long conversation, which arcs back probably hundreds of years. So if autograph survives for another 30 years, then there'll be more progress. It probably will, I hope. But 30 years ago, this conversation would not have been possible. Did I want the conversation 30 years ago to be happening like this? Absolutely. Would I have been able to probably deliver it? Probably not. So patience is really quite important in that game, because his influence is actually really quite wide and far.
That's a segue to the second question.
That was a good question, so you can have a second question.
It's a gift. It's a gift.
I came in late, I'm sorry, and my partner said, you missed some incredible conversation about time, and you just kind of alluded to it with the comment about patience, and she said, try to find some way to ask an open-ended question about time to get them talking about time again. So this is my plea to ask you to open-endedly meditate on time.
Time. Okay. Well, be careful what you ask for, because we could be here all night. No, I have this theory about time, is that we live in different times. Your time and my time are totally different. I don't share time with you. I don't share the same time as my kids. You know, I refuse to live in certain times. And it's really, really important, because I think I could argue that, you know, the way that you are in, we'll do this personally, the way that you are in time and the way that time works on me are very different experiences with those experiences. Some things do take longer for some parts or for some people than others. I would argue that, you know, time is not particularly kind to women artists, right? It seems to me, I would argue that time is not particularly kind to queer artists, it seems to me. It seems to me that time is very generous to a lot of white male men in the world. So time has got this way of actually working for and against people and communities and spaces. Time doesn't seem to do work or help, you know, those that spend time in factories. Time's not doing particularly well for people in parts of the geographical locations that are under continual stress. Time sometimes operates within a complete space of the concentration camp, right? Some people seem to do time more than others. Why is that, right? Some people are really caught up in the very idea of what it means to be a person on the planet and how time is precariously, you know, theirs not to have. Where is leisure in people's lives in time? Policed time, you know, paid time. So time is not about just, you know, it's midnight or it's a long time or history has passed. How we're allowed to be in time is really quite important. So I've written a lot about racial time, because racial time is really burdensome. Racial time is like, you know, it's like wearing lead boots to work every day and then expected to do even more work. It's sinking, you know. It's really interesting. I have this, just on this last point, I'm a terrible swimmer. And I used to think, oh my God, I'm crap. I hate the deep water. I'm scared of it, all the rest of it. And then I learned, actually, and it's really funny, I'm part of 2% of the world. 2% of the world, you'll enjoy this part, 2% of the world are actually officially dense, right? So I sink, right? Really, I actually am, you know, I sink quite easily. And my kids look at me and they think, God, you work so hard in the water, Dad, to stay, just things like, what do you do? I'm like this all the time. And they're like this going, this is all fantastic, really great fun. Whereas my time in the water is like hugely laborious, right? Just to stay in the same space as them. And that's how time works.
I see a couple more hands going up. What is our time? What's our time, Jen? You're the boss.
Time.
6:05. Okay.
There's one at the back.
We started late. Okay. We'll take your question in the back.
Just wondering, what was your most profound discovery going through the archive of this map for such a long period of time? What made you say, wow?
I don't think there was a wow moment, really, to be honest. I think I always appreciated where, you know, when work arrives, you like think, oh, thank God, more than wow. It's like something that I can actually work with, something that actually, you know, when you go through the archive, it's not like, I don't like the word discovery anyway, just as a term. I think the more I was in it, the more you're in it, the more, it's more like a favorite soundtrack. There are some things which you just keep on playing. You know, I play Love Supreme probably once a week because I need it in my life, right? I need Coltrane. When you're with Rotimi's work, you realize that when, you know, in the early, excuse me one second. In the early days of Autograph, when you're trying to make a case for really good practice and the practice is there, you're like, thank you, right? So that's what I mean by it's like a gift. When the work is coming through the door and people are knocking on and saying, you know, I'm a photographer, I'm doing all this great stuff, aren't I fantastic? And you go, not really. I didn't really have that feeling with Rotimi's work. I'm like, this is fantastic and we need to really amplify it, right? So that's what the relationship's like. And because I've been quite close to it, I just feel like people, you watching people now understand it and work with it and collect it and want and acquire it and treat it with the reverence and the care that it's there. That's just part of the job. But obviously, in terms of personal satisfaction, because that's what we got to work for often, that's the part that you look back in the rearview mirror that I was talking about earlier, and you go, well, that's not necessarily something that's up front and central that I need to work with now. That's definitely moving past to a point where you can look back and think, we did that for that artist.
We'll take one last question up here, up front.
I'll try and make it quick. I want to ask about identity and photography as an art medium. So identity, especially as a person of color, when it comes to creating, most time, and correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like you have to create from you being a person of color is the whole work itself, instead of bringing your own perspective into it. And I feel like he did a good job at, it's like you're telling your story of who you are, part of you. It's like being Nigerian, being queer, being all these things was part, not the full thing exactly. And as a person of color trying to get your art, it feels like you have to give that perspective only. Like it's the entire work itself. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. And the next one was just on photography as an art medium. Today feels like it's a bit lost in a sense. And you said you could easily go with celebrity photographers. I think today look amazing, like Gabriel Moses and Campbell Addy, and that work is amazing. But that storytelling is more down perspective rather than to serve a bigger picture, and how such a suggestion how we can get back into that kind of work.
There's a lot there, isn't there? I think you're in a really lucky position, actually, to be honest. If you wind, I mean, there's more stuff now out there from, I mean, I think photography it's possibly now seen as a global medium. 25, 30 years ago, French, German, North American photographers dominated the narrative. So we're now in a kind of global, there's a place now, if you go contemporary Indian photography, or contemporary work from the global south, or contemporary work from Southeast Asia, bingo. You can find work all over. There's biennales and triennales everywhere. There's great things happening with the camera. There's, festivals across Africa. I was in Bamako in '94 for the first moment where Seydou Keita and Malik Sedibé and Samuel Fosso, boom, right? Fantastic moment in the history of photography, but it's only 1994. So it's not that long ago, right? So you're in a place now where all these booms have happened and you can begin to cultivate them. You're young, you're bright, you're super bright. So go out there and take all that language and have a conversation with it. And go out there and have a conversation with Henri Latigue as well if you want, or Cartier-Bresson, or whoever. We need to be more Baldwin-like in terms of where we are. Now, look, on a dark day, I could have a really I could have a conversation about the positionality and the opportunities that I may well have had. But I think you can stay in that lane if you want to, or you can just refuse to be put in that space. I think you have to if you have a compulsion to make the work, to write the words, then I think you have to do it. I think what people like Tyler Mitchell are doing and Zanelli Mahuli are doing, and a myriad now of great voices from around the world, then good. I think what's interesting also, just on part of that there is a kind of unlocking, if you like, of spaces and places where traditional gatekeepers hold the keys to who gets in the institution. So, I love an argument, as you can probably tell, and I will have an argument around institutional policy and who gets there and who doesn't. And I think those kind of advocates are pretty vocal in the space still. I think culture is contested, as we can see fundamentally with what's happening in North America right now. Things have been wound back. So if you're in it, you're in a game, and the game is really serious because it's about who gets to tell the histories and the stories of this world. So you have one, and we can amplify them, and you have community, and we can build on that. You might not get to the place where you imagine, you might die before it ever happens. But hopefully, there's enough of us and enough of them to have a proper and honest conversation about what gets said in the world. Oh, thank you.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Mark, thank you so much for this
Pleasure.
fantastic talk. It's such a privilege. We're not running off anywhere. Gallery's open for until 7 p.m. So feel free to grab another drink, see the show, and we also have books as well as posters that Mark has signed. So please visit the bookstore as well.
Yes, one thing, if you want culture to live, buy the book, because we need you to do that.
There you go. Thank
Much
you
more
all.
important than a show.
Have a good night.
Thank you.